The gun was already in his hand when she said it. "I know about a leaner." Cornelius Merritt stood in the doorway of his own barn, the lantern light cutting sharp shadows across the hard planes of his face, and for the first time in 4 years he felt something crack open inside his chest. Not sorrow, not anger, something worse. Something that felt dangerously close to being seen. Lydia Yates had not flinched when he raised the revolver. She stood in the center of his barn with hay dust settling on her dark hair, and her green eyes locked on his, with the kind of ferocious calm that belonged to a woman who had already decided she had nothing left to lose. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. Dried blood from a cut on her temple had streaked like war paint down her cheek, and she said the name of his dead wife like she had every right to it. "You don't know a thing," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended, rougher. "I know she didn't leave you." Lydia took one step forward, which was either the bravest thing he had ever witnessed or the most foolish. "I know what Garland Price did to her. And I know he plans to do the same thing to this ranch, to your land, to everything you have left, starting tomorrow morning." The gun did not waver, but something behind his eyes did. "How?" he said. It was not quite a question. It was the sound of a man calculating the distance between what he believed and what he feared was the truth. "Because he told my father the same story he told your wife, and my father believed him." Her jaw tightened. "And then my father disappeared into the Cimarron River 6 months later with a signed deed in his coat pocket and rocks tied to his ankles." The lantern swayed between them in a gust of night wind that slipped through the gap in the barn wall. Cornelius looked at this woman he had known for less than one full day, this woman who had arrived on the afternoon stage from Amarillo with a carpetbag and a letter of introduction he had never asked for and never wanted, and he felt the gun in his hand become suddenly very heavy. He lowered it. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment Lydia Yates proved that the most fortified man in the New Mexico territory still had a living heart inside the walls he had spent 4 years building around himself. But to understand why that moment mattered, and why it would come to define both of their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined when the sun rose that morning, you have to go back to the beginning of that day. Back to when Cornelius Merritt was still certain he felt nothing at all. The Merritt Ranch sat in the high desert country between Santa Fe and the Texas border, in a valley where the red mesa walls turned gold at dawn, and the cottonwood trees along the creek ran so thick that you could not see through them from horseback. It was 1878, and the cattle business in that part of New Mexico territory was a complicated and often violent negotiation between men who had arrived with money, men who had arrived with guns, and men like Cornelius who had arrived with nothing but a will to work, and had built something real out of red clay and stubbornness. He was 34 years old and looked every minute of it, not because he was weak, but because the land had pressed itself into him the way it presses into everything it touches. His hands were calloused to the point of looking carved. The sun had darkened his skin to the color of old saddle leather and put fine lines at the corners of his gray eyes, eyes that the men who worked for him described as the kind that made you feel he was reading something written on the inside of your skull. He ran 3,000 head of cattle and employed 9 men, not counting old Petrus who kept the books and Domingo who cooked and considered himself above being counted. He had built the main house himself over 3 years with timber hauled from the mountains, and it was a solid, plain, well-made house that showed you exactly who its owner was. No unnecessary ornamentation, no weakness in the foundation, every nail driven with intention. He had also not spoken to a woman about anything that mattered since the winter of 1874, when a leaner had gone missing, and the official word from the county sheriff was that she had left him voluntarily, packed her belongings in the night, and taken a coach to Albuquerque. Cornelius had not believed it for 1 hour. But he could not prove otherwise, and the man who could have told him the truth was Garland Price, the largest land owner in 3 counties, and the man who ran the county court with the quiet authority of someone who has never needed to raise his voice, because everyone already knows what happens when they cross him. So Cornelius had done what a man with no proof and no allies does. He had buried the grief down somewhere deep, sealed it with work and silence, and gone on. He had told himself that going on was enough. That functioning was the same as living. That a man who could run a successful cattle operation, meet his obligations, and keep his hands busy did not need to feel anything in the softer registers of human experience. He had been telling himself this for 4 years. He had been very nearly convincing himself it was true. And then the afternoon stage had rattled down the road that curved along the creek and stopped at the entrance to his property, and Lydia Yates had stepped out of it. He had not been at the gate to meet her. He had been at the north pasture fixing a broken section of fence line, because he had not known she was coming and would not have gone to meet her even if he had known, because he had not invited her and did not want her there. She had appeared instead at the fence line, standing on the other side of it with her carpetbag in one hand and a folded letter in the other, and she had said, "Mr. Merritt, my name is Lydia Yates. I believe there was a correspondence between your foreman and the Women's Placement Agency in Amarillo." He had looked at her for a long moment without speaking. She was tall for a woman, with a straight back and dark hair pinned up under a practical bonnet, and a face that would have been called handsome in a drawing room and was called striking out here where the light was honest and the angles were severe. Her eyes were a particular shade of green that he noticed without wanting to and filed away in the part of his mind that catalogued irrelevant facts. "There was no such correspondence," he said flatly. Her composure did not flicker. "There was. Your foreman, a Mr. Tomas Esperanza, wrote to the agency 8 weeks ago requesting a housekeeper and general domestic manager. He indicated that the position was urgently needed." Cornelius set down his fence post driver with controlled precision. "Tomas Esperanza works for me. He does not hire for me." "Perhaps you ought to take that up with Mr. Esperanza," she said, with the careful tone of someone who has been on the receiving end of men's frustration enough times to know how to redirect it without flinching from it. He had, in fact, taken it up with Tomas Esperanza that same evening, in the kitchen of the main house, with considerably less composure than he would have liked. Tomas had stood at the table and endured the full weight of Cornelius Merritt's legendary silence before saying, with the unshakable dignity of a man who has worked for someone long enough to tell them the truth, "The house needs a person in it, Cornelius. A living person who can keep it from becoming a monument to a woman who is gone. The hands talk. They say this place feels like a graveyard. They are not wrong." Cornelius had told him to find her somewhere else to stay and left the kitchen. Tomas had put Lydia Yates in the spare room off the kitchen, which was what Cornelius had known would happen and which he had decided to tolerate for 1 night and 1 night only, after which she would be returned to wherever she came from with a fair wage for her trouble. That had been his plan at noon. By sunset, everything was different. The trouble had started, as trouble in the New Mexico territory almost always did, with Garland Price. Price rode onto the Merritt ranch at 3 in the afternoon, with 2 men flanking him, and the particular ease of someone who considers all land within his sight to be functionally his own. He was 52 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a silver mustache and the kind of charm that worked on everyone the first time, and on no one the second time, once they understood what lived underneath it. He had built his empire through a combination of legal manipulation, strategic pressure, and the selective application of violence that he kept far enough from his own hands to maintain the fiction of respectability. Cornelius came in from the pasture when Domingo told him there was company, and he stood in the yard with his hat in his hand and watched Price dismount with the carefully neutral expression he had perfected over years of dealing with men he despised. "Cornelius," Price said, extending his hand. Cornelius shook it, because you always shook the hand of the wolf to let him know you saw him clearly. "Garland," he said. Price looked around the yard with the slow satisfaction of a man taking inventory. Place is looking good, real good. You've added to the north section. Some, Cornelius said. Good land up there. Price's eyes moved to the house with a quality of appraisal that made the skin on the back of Cornelius's neck tight. I'll get right to it. You know the alderman grazing rights come up for reassignment next spring. County board will be making decisions in November. I'm aware. I'd like to make you a comfortable offer before that process starts. Save us both the trouble. Price smiled with his mouth. You've been carrying a lot of weight out here for a long time, Cornelius. Running this kind of operation alone, a man gets tired. I'm not tired, Cornelius said. There was a pause in which Price assessed him with those flat, practiced eyes, and Cornelius looked back without expression. We'll revisit the conversation, Price said. He gathered his reins, then appeared to think of something and turned back with the careful casualness of a man who has rehearsed the gesture. Oh, I heard you took on help. Domestic arrangement. Where's the woman from? The question was too specific and too casual at the same time. Something cold moved through Cornelius's chest, not for himself but for a reason he could not yet name. Not your concern, he said. Price smiled again. Just being neighborly. He put his hat on and rode out with his men, and Cornelius watched them until they were around the bend in the road. And then he stood in the yard for a long moment, thinking about the fact that Garland Price had arrived on the same day as Lydia Yates and had asked about her specifically. He went to find her. She was in the kitchen with Domingo, and they were engaged in what appeared to be a genuine disagreement about the proper way to make corn bread, which Domingo took as seriously as he took anything, and which Lydia appeared to be enjoying with a restrained smile that she erased the moment Cornelius walked in and she saw his face. "Can I speak with you?" he said. It was not quite a question. She followed him out onto the back porch without argument, which he noticed. Most people who came to this ranch found reasons to avoid being alone with him. She didn't. "How did you know to come here?" he asked. "The real reason." She looked at him steadily. "I told you, the agency." "The agency sent you here, but someone told you to go to the agency. Someone gave you this specific ranch as the destination. I need to know who." Something shifted in her expression. Not guilt, not surprise. Something more like the look of a woman who had been waiting for someone to ask the right question and was not entirely certain whether this was a safe place to answer it. "May I ask why you want to know?" she said carefully. "Because Garland Price came here this afternoon and asked about you by category before I had mentioned you to anyone." The color in her face did not drain exactly. It went the particular pale of someone whose fears have just been confirmed. "He knows I'm here," she said. It was not a question. Apparently, Cornelius leaned against the porch railing and studied her. "Who sent you to this ranch specifically?" She was quiet for 3 seconds, which in his experience was the amount of time an honest person needed to decide to tell a truth that frightened them, as opposed to the 1 second a liar needed to invent a comfortable story. "A man named Francis Aldred," she said. "He was a lawyer in Amarillo. He handled my father's estate, what was left of it. He told me that if I was going to end up in New Mexico territory, there was one rancher I could trust, and that was Cornelius Merritt of the Cimarron Valley." Cornelius felt something tighten at the back of his throat. Francis Aldred was a name he had not heard in 3 years. Aldred had been Alina's uncle's business partner, a man with an honest practice and a quiet reputation, the kind of man who stayed in lanes and minded accounts and was not given to dramatic pronouncements. The idea that Aldred had specifically directed this woman to this ranch was significant in a way he could feel but not yet fully articulate. "What happened to your father?" he asked. And Lydia Yates looked at him with those steady green eyes and told him the first part of it, standing on his back porch in the late afternoon light, while the cottonwoods rattled along the creek, and the smell of Domingo's corn bread drifted through the kitchen window. Her father, Robert Yates, had been a cattleman in the Texas Panhandle. Not a large operation, but a solid one, the kind of property that had been built over 20 years of careful work. He had met Garland Price at a stockman's association, meeting in Tascosa in 1876, and Price had expressed friendly interest in the Yates land as a potential route for a new cattle trail. He had proposed a simple legal arrangement, a right-of-way agreement, something a lawyer would draw up and both men would sign. It would benefit everyone. Robert Yates had signed it. 6 weeks later, it emerged that what he had signed was not a right-of-way agreement but a deed transfer with a right of occupancy clause that Price's lawyer had buried in paragraph 11 of a 14-paragraph document using language so technical it would have taken a specialist to decode it. Yates had confronted Price. Price had been regretful, confused, suggested there had been a misunderstanding that could surely be cleared up, suggested Yates meet with him privately to discuss terms. Lydia's father had gone to that private meeting in December of 1876. He had never come home. The county sheriff of Potter County, Texas, had concluded after a brief investigation that Robert Yates had most likely ridden into difficulties on the trail and met with an accident. There was no body. There were no witnesses. There was only a signed deed in Price's possession, and a 22-year-old woman left with a sold-off property, a pittance of cash, and the certainty that something terrible had been done to her father by a man who considered himself untouchable. She had spent 2 years trying to find proof. She had spent those years in Amarillo, working as a seamstress, saving money, talking to lawyers, writing letters, tracking down anyone who had done business with Price and found themselves on the losing end of it. And in that process she had found Francis Aldred, who had told her about Lydia Merritt. Cornelius listened to all of this without interrupting. He was standing very still in the way he had learned to stand very still when something was happening inside him that he did not want visible on his face. "Aldred told you Lydia didn't leave," he said, when she had finished. "He told me she had uncovered something about Price's land holdings, some discrepancy in the title records. He said she had written to him about it and then gone silent, and that the official story of her departure had never made sense to him because she had not mentioned any intention to leave and because certain items, personal items, were still in the house when you returned from the north pasture." Cornelius said nothing. "Her hairbrush," Lydia said quietly. "A locket her mother gave her. Things a woman does not leave behind when she packs to start a new life." The silence between them was the heaviest kind. It had weight and texture and temperature. "You came here to build a case against Price," Cornelius said finally. "I came here because I have nowhere else to go," she said, with a bluntness that was somehow more affecting than sorrow would have been. "My resources are nearly exhausted. Aldred is ill and cannot help me further. Price has effectively blacklisted my name with every established attorney in the Amarillo area. I came to this ranch because Aldred told me you were the one person who had both a reason to want the truth and the capability of doing something about it if it could be found." She paused. "And because I have been afraid for 18 months and I am tired of being afraid alone." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Come inside. Domingo will feed you. And tomorrow we will talk about what you know and what I know and whether together it amounts to something that can be used." He had said it practically, without warmth, as one might propose a business arrangement. But something in his chest, some sealed compartment he had told himself was empty, had shifted 2 inches to the left when she said she was tired of being afraid alone. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the chair by the window of his bedroom, the same chair he had sat in 4 years ago waiting for Lydia to come through the door, and he thought about the hairbrush. He had known, without letting himself know, that she had not left voluntarily. He had built 4 years of numbness on top of that knowing like mortar over a wound. And now this woman had walked onto his land and with 5 specific words about a hairbrush and a locket cracked the mortar clean through. He was not grieving Lydia freshly. He had grieved her in secret for 4 years. What he was feeling was something else. Something that he identified with the same reluctant precision he applied to everything as the sensation of being found out. Of someone looking at him and seeing through the construct of the man who felt nothing to the man underneath, who had never stopped feeling everything, and had simply decided it was safer not to. He did not examine the fact that the person who had done this looking was Lydia Yates specifically. He did not examine it because he was not ready to examine it, and because he was a man who had learned to be careful about the things he approached directly. At 6 in the morning, he was already at the breakfast table when she came through from the kitchen side, and they ate Domingo's eggs and biscuits in a silence that was somehow companionable rather than awkward, which was a thing Cornelius had not experienced at that table in 4 years and which he refused to comment on. He told her, over the coffee, what he knew, what he had pieced together over years of careful observation, and what he had never been able to prove. The pattern of Price's acquisitions, the specific legal mechanism he used, the buried clause in complex documents, the friendly approach followed by the private meeting followed by the disappearance of the problem. 3 men before Robert Yates that Cornelius had been able to identify. Possibly more. The county recorder's office in Santa Fe held deeds that told the story if you knew how to read them, but gaining access to those records required either legal standing or the cooperation of someone inside the office, and Cornelius had neither. Lydia listened to all of this with her elbows on the table and her eyes moving over some internal architecture of the problem that he could almost watch her building. "The county recorder," she said. "Is there anyone in that office who has a reason to want Price exposed?" "One person," he said slowly. "A deputy recorder named Anselmo Vega. His family held grazing rights in the eastern section that Price absorbed 4 years ago. Anselmo was a boy then. He's a man now and he's in a position to see the records. Has he ever been approached? Not safely. What would make it safe enough?" Cornelius turned his coffee cup in his hands, a habit she would later come to recognize as the physical sign that he was turning a problem over with genuine concentration. If someone could offer him legal protection and documentation of what he found simultaneously, he said. If there was a lawyer willing to receive the evidence and file it in such a way that exposing Anselmo as the source became unnecessary. Aldred is too ill to travel," she said. "But he has a junior partner. A man named Theodore Marsh. I met him twice. He's young and he doesn't have much of a reputation yet, which means he hasn't been bought and doesn't have anything to lose by being honest." Cornelius looked at her. "You've thought about this a long time." 2 years, she said. "And you came here because you needed someone who could get to Anselmo Vega and had reason enough to try." "And because," she said, meeting his eyes with the directness that he was beginning to understand was simply who she was, not performance but structure. "I needed to tell someone the truth about what I believe happened to Alina, even if nothing else came of it. Because it seemed wrong that the man who loved her should go on not knowing." He stood up from the table abruptly, not rudely, but because he needed a moment he could not ask for with words. He went to the kitchen window and looked out at the yard where Tomas was already moving cattle toward the north pasture with 2 of the hands, and he breathed slowly through whatever it was that was happening in his chest. When he turned back around, she was watching him with an expression that contained no pity. That was the thing that steadied him. She looked at him like a person looks at another person they respect, not someone to be managed or consoled. "All right," he said. "We write to Theodore Marsh today. We send Tomas's youngest hand, Pio, on the fast horse to Santa Fe tonight to speak to Anselmo Vega. And we do it before Price decides that your presence here is a threat he needs to manage. He'll already be deciding that," she said. "I know." They worked through the morning on the letter to Marsh, sitting across from each other at the desk in the front room with papers between them and the window open to the dry October air. She knew more about legal procedure than he expected. Not lawyer's knowledge, but the knowledge of a woman who had spent 2 years trying to force legal institutions to help her, and had learned from every failure exactly what the limitations were. He knew more about Price's specific landholdings and their history than she could have assembled from the outside, and between them they constructed a document that was not a legal brief, but was the next best thing. A detailed, chronological account with named individuals, specific dates, and the names of the deeds they believed had been manipulated, which Anselmo Vega could either confirm or deny against the actual records. They did not talk about anything other than the work. But there was a quality to the silence around the work, a kind of ease that Cornelius was acutely conscious of. He had not sat at this desk with another person since Eleanor. He had not shared this kind of focused attention with anyone in 4 years. He kept noticing small things, the way Lydia held her pen, pressing slightly harder than necessary, as if she wanted to make sure the words stayed, the way she occasionally rubbed the side of her left hand where there was an old ink stain that would not fully wash out, the way she caught herself about to say something, and then reconsidered and sharpened it before she said it. He noticed these things without meaning to, and without any clear idea of what he was supposed to do with them. At midday, Domingo brought them food and set it between them on the desk with an expression of carefully managed blankness that told Cornelius the old cook had reached his own conclusions and was very deliberately not voicing them. "Domingo," Cornelius said. "Señor Merritt," Domingo said, and retreated. Lydia picked up her fork and then looked at Cornelius with a flicker of something that might have been amusement. "He disapproves of me," she said. "He approves of you," Cornelius said. "That's the face he makes when he approves of something and has decided not to say so to preserve his dignity." She looked surprised that he had said that. He was somewhat surprised himself. "How long has he been with you?" she asked. 12 years. He came with the first cattle drive from Texas. He cooked for 6 men on the trail, got to the valley, looked at it, and said he was staying. He paused. "He's the only person on this property who has never been afraid of me." "He has excellent judgment," she said mildly, and returned to her food. He looked at the top of her bowed head for a moment before he realized he was looking and looked at his own plate instead. Tomas came in at 2 o'clock, and Cornelius spoke with him privately in the kitchen, giving him the plan and watching Tomas receive it with the steady competence that had made him invaluable. Tomas was 40 years old, the son of a Tejano family that had ranched in the territory for 2 generations before the legal upheavals of the land grant era had taken most of it from them, and he had a personal knowledge of what Garland Price represented that went deeper than grievance into something more like bone knowledge of a particular kind of injustice. He looked at the sealed letter to Anselmo Vega and nodded. "I'll send Pio tonight," he said. "He'll take the creek trail, not the road." "Good." Cornelius started to turn away and then stopped. "Tomas, the woman, Lydia Yates." "Yes," Tomas said. "You wrote to the agency about her." "I wrote to the agency about the position," Tomas said carefully. "You directed them to send someone to this ranch." "I directed them to send someone competent," Tomas said. "The agency chose the person." It was technically accurate, and Cornelius knew it was also entirely disingenuous and decided he did not currently have the time or the energy to pursue it. "She'll need the spare room for more than one night," he said. Tomas's expression did not change. "I'll make sure it's prepared properly," he said. Cornelius went back to the front room. They finished the letter by mid-afternoon, and Lydia went to help Domingo with the kitchen, which Domingo accepted with the gruff condescension of a man who has ruled his kitchen alone for 12 years, and is not about to pretend he needs assistance, but who Cornelius could hear through the wall engaging in an increasingly lively conversation about the relative merits of different beans within 20 minutes. He took the finished letter and read through it alone at the desk, and as he read it, he felt the specific weight of 4 years of unanswered questions sitting behind the words. If Anselmo Vega confirmed what they believed, if Theodore Marsh was willing to file it, if the documentation in the county records was intact and had not been altered, these were significant ifs, but they were the first ifs he had had in 4 years, and there was a quality to them, a quality of possibility that felt like something he had forgotten he was missing. He was still sitting at the desk when the first sound of hoofbeats came from the road. Not Price this time. One man, riding hard. It was one of Price's men, A rider named Carter who had come before on Price's behalf. One of those men who carry messages for powerful people and have learned to affect the authority of their employer while delivering them. He came to the gate and called out, and Cornelius went to meet him in the yard. "Mr. Price sends his regards," Carter said, not dismounting. "He says he's heard there's a woman named Yates on your property, and he wants you to know that she's been involved in some unfortunate business back in Texas, making false accusations against respectable people. He thought you ought to know, given she's your guest." Cornelius looked up at Carter with the full weight of his gray eyes. "You tell Price I'll decide for myself who's respectable and who isn't," he said. "And you tell him the next man who rides onto my property uninvited will find the gate locked." Carter rode out. Cornelius stood in the yard and felt the shape of the situation sharpen. Price already knew she was here. Price was already running the playbook, the friendly warning, the suggestion of unreliability, the softening up that preceded the harder pressure. It was the same pattern, always the same pattern. He went inside and told Lydia. She received it without visible alarm, but he noticed that she set down the knife she had been using to peel potatoes and gripped the edge of the counter briefly before releasing it. "How much time do we have?" she said. "Before he decides a warning isn't enough, a day, maybe two. Will Pio get to Santa Fe and back in time? If he rides through the night, he can be there by morning. If Anselmo Vega is willing to move quickly, Pio could have documentation back here by nightfall tomorrow." She turned from the counter and looked at him. "That's very tight." "Yes," he said. "What happens to the ranch if Price moves before we have anything concrete?" He considered the question. "He won't move against the ranch directly yet. He'll move against you first, try to remove the variable." The weight of that settled over her visibly, not as panic, but as the particular stillness of someone absorbing a known danger freshly. He noticed that she did not ask him whether he was going to protect her. She seemed to assume it, and he found he was glad she did, because it meant he did not have to say it, and saying it would have required him to examine why the assumption felt so natural. "All right," she said. "Then we make sure that before anything happens, someone other than the two of us and Tomas knows the full extent of what we suspect. Is there anyone in Santa Fe, a federal contact, a marshal?" "There's a U.S. deputy marshal named Rufus Clay in Santa Fe. I've met him twice. He's an honest man." "Can Pio carry a second letter to him?" Cornelius thought about it. "A letter from me to Clay, naming Price and naming the specific patterns. Enough to open a federal interest if something should happen to either of us." "Yes," she said. "Exactly that." They spent another hour writing the letter to Deputy Marshal Clay, and this one Cornelius wrote alone while Lydia stood at the window watching the road with the careful attention of someone who has learned that danger announces itself in advance if you watch for it. He wrote clearly and without emotion, describing Garland Price's operations as he understood them, naming a leaner, naming Robert Yates, naming the pattern of legal manipulation, and the three men he could identify who had lost land to Price under suspicious circumstances. He sealed it and called Tomas in and gave him both letters and told him to have Pio on the trail by dusk. The sun went down over the mesa walls in its usual extravagance of red and orange that Cornelius had long since stopped actively noticing, in the way you stop noticing beauty that has become so familiar it blends into background. But he noticed that Lydia watched it from the front porch with an expression that was not quite peace, more the look of someone putting something away for safekeeping, as if she wanted to hold onto one clean thing in the middle of a complicated situation. He stood in the doorway and watched her watch the sunset, and he felt with sudden and unwelcome clarity that she was beautiful, not in the way that he catalogued irrelevant facts, in the way that mattered, in the way that arrived without being asked for and set up residence in the chest regardless of whether it was convenient. He went back inside. Dinner was the best meal Domingo had made in months, which Cornelius suspected was Lydia's influence in the kitchen, and which he said nothing about. They ate together, the three of them, Cornelius and Lydia at the big table and Domingo, materializing periodically from the kitchen to deliver things and make pronouncements about the food and disappear again. It was the closest thing to a normal evening that the main house had seen in 4 years, and Cornelius was aware of it the way you are aware of something that exposes by its presence how absent it has been. After dinner, he told her to get rest, that he would keep watch from the front porch until midnight and then Tomas would take over. "You don't trust that Price will wait until morning," she said. "I trust that Price will do what's most advantageous. If it becomes advantageous to move tonight, he'll move tonight." She looked at him for a moment. "You've been carrying this knowledge about a leaner for 4 years," she said, "waiting, watching Price, not able to act." "Yes," he said, "that must have been." She stopped herself. "Suffocating," he said, surprising himself with the word. She looked at him steadily with those green eyes, and he felt the specific sensation of being seen again, the sensation that he had felt when she first said Aliner's name, and that seemed to be becoming less alarming with each repetition, which was itself something he needed to examine and was not yet ready to. "Get some rest," he said again, because he could not stay in the middle of that look any longer without doing something impractical. "Tomorrow will be a long day." She went inside. He sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees and the stars overhead in their immense, untroubled patterns, and he tried to remember the last time he had sat outside at night and not felt completely alone. He could not remember. It was 2 hours past midnight when he heard it, not hoofbeats on the road. Something quieter, movement in the barn. He was off the porch and crossing the yard with his revolver drawn before the sound could sharpen into something identifiable, moving in the dark with the ease of a man who has walked his own land so many times he knows it by feel. The barn door was half open. He went through it low and fast. Lydia was standing in the center of the barn. She had not heard him coming because she was looking at the back wall, where someone had left a note nailed to a post sometime in the past hour. She had a lantern she had lit on her way in, and her face was white in the lantern light, and in her hand was a piece of paper that she was reading with the particular stillness of someone absorbing information that confirms their worst fears. She heard him behind her then and spun around, and that was when she saw the gun in his hand. And instead of stepping back, instead of showing fear, she looked at him with those steady green eyes and said, in a voice that was perfectly controlled despite the pallor of her face, "I know about a leaner." The moment hung in the air between them like a held breath. He lowered the gun. "What does the note say?" he asked. She held it out to him. He took it and read it in the lantern light. It was brief and it was blunt, and it was the kind of message that served as a final warning before something worse. It said, "Leave before dawn, take the woman, or what happened to Lydia Merritt will happen to both of you." Cornelius read it twice. He felt the rage move through him in one clean wave, not the hot, reactive kind, but the cold, purposeful kind that he had learned was far more dangerous because it did not dissipate. "He knows about Pio," Lydia said. "He knows we've sent letters." How could he know that quickly? "Someone on the ranch," she said, not accusation, assessment. He thought about who had known, Tomas, Domingo himself. Lydia, Pio, who was already on the trail. He went through each person with the cold machinery of a man cataloging an impossible fact and arrived at one uncomfortable conclusion. "Not someone on the ranch," he said. "Someone watching the ranch, watching the creek trail, saw Pio leave." She let out a slow breath. "If they stopped him, Pio knows this country from boyhood. He won't be stopped on the trail if he doesn't want to be. But they know we've sent word, which means the note is a bluff. If they were going to move against us violently tonight, they'd have done it already instead of leaving a warning. This is the last step of the soft approach before they move to something harder." She was close to him now, within arm's reach, because the barn was not large, and because they had moved toward each other in the way people do when they are processing danger together in a small space. He could see the dried blood on her temple where a branch had caught her in the darkness when she'd heard something and come out to investigate. He could see that her hands were steady, but her breathing was not quite right. Not panicked, just careful, the breathing of someone working hard to hold their nerve. "You're bleeding," he said. "It's nothing, a branch in the dark." He reached up without particularly planning to and tucked a strand of hair back from the cut on her temple, and the gesture was so small and so automatic and so completely out of character with everything he had been for 4 years that he stopped moving the second he registered what he was doing. She had gone very still. He lowered his hand. "We go inside," he said. "We keep the lamps low. In the morning we wait for Pio. And if Price makes a move before Pio returns, then we deal with what's in front of us," he said. "We've dealt with worse." He said "we" without thinking about it, and registered it afterward in the brief silence between them. And she did not point it out, but something in her expression shifted slightly, like a door that has been opened one careful inch. They went back inside together. He put the rifle near the front window and the revolver on the kitchen table, and he made coffee because neither of them was going to sleep, and it was something to do with his hands. She sat across from him at the kitchen table with the note between them, and they went over what they knew and what they needed and what the possible outcomes were. And somewhere in the second hour of this, the conversation shifted, not abruptly, but in the way conversations shift when people are no longer only discussing a problem, but have begun to trust each other with the things that live around the problem. She told him about her mother, who had died when Lydia was 14, and about the years after when it had been just her and her father on the ranch, and how she had learned to love the land not as scenery, but as something you worked with and argued with and depended on. She told him about the 2 years in Amarillo, which had been the hardest years of her life, not because of the work or the poverty, but because of the particular grief of having lost not only her father, but the life she had understood herself to be living, the certainty of place and belonging. He told her, in return, about Eleanor, not the grief of her loss, which he had never put into words for anyone, but about who she had been. Clever and restless, and with a laugh that you could hear from the barn. She had hated the isolation of the territory winters, but loved the spring with a fervor that embarrassed her. She had started the garden that still produced tomatoes every September whether Cornelius remembered to water it or not, apparently having established roots deep enough to be independent of human attention. Eleanor would have liked that. She had believed in that kind of persistence. He stopped talking and realized he had said more about Eleanor in the past 10 minutes than in the past 4 years combined, and that the reason he had been able to was sitting across from him with her elbows on the table and her coffee cup between her hands, listening in the particular way that means a person is receiving what you say rather than waiting for you to finish so they can respond. "She sounds like someone worth remembering properly," Lydia said. "She was," he said. "You've been remembering her in secret." He looked at her. "Yes," he said simply. "That's too heavy to carry alone," she said. He did not respond to that directly because there was no safe way to respond to it without acknowledging things he was not ready to acknowledge. But he felt the truth of it land in him like a stone into still water, spreading in rings. The night passed. Dawn came in the pale, lavender way it comes in the high desert, the darkness softening before the light actually arrives, as if the day is being polite about the intrusion. Cornelius was at the window when the first color showed above the eastern mesa, and he was aware that behind him Lydia had fallen asleep in the kitchen chair with her head against the wall and her coffee cup still in her hands, and that he had covered her with the blanket from the back of the chair at some point in the night, and that this was the single most domestic gesture he had made since Eleanor, and that he was going to think about that later when there was time. Tomas arrived at dawn from his watch position at the gate with 2 of the hands, and Cornelius briefed him on the note, and they discussed the likely timeline for Price's next move. Tomas listened and then said, with the careful directness of someone who has decided to say an uncomfortable thing, "If Price sends men today in a formal capacity, there's not much we can do legally until we have documentation. But if he sends men informally, we can meet that differently." "We won't have a gunfight on this ranch," Cornelius said. "No," Tomas agreed. "But we can show him that his informal options are not as simple as he imagines." They positioned the hands strategically, not aggressively, nothing that could be read as provocation, but in a way that made clear the ranch was not undefended and that any approach would be observed. Cornelius went over the fence lines personally that morning to give himself something purposeful to do and to think through the situation clearly without the particular distraction of being in the same room as Lydia. The distraction was a problem he had not anticipated and did not know what to do with. He had spent 4 years constructing a version of himself that did not need anything it didn't already have, and in the space of less than 1 full day this woman had, through no particular effort of her own, dismantled that construction with a thoroughness that he found both alarming and, in some part of himself, he was not ready to introduce to the rest of himself, profoundly relieving. He did not understand yet whether what he was feeling was simply the normal human response to unexpected connection after years of isolation, or whether it was something specific to her, something about the particular combination of her directness and her steadiness, and the way she faced difficult things without performing toughness, just embodying it. He was not ready to know which it was. He was especially not ready to know it because everything around them was in motion, and this was not the time. But he thought about it while he checked the fence lines, and he thought about it while he rode the north pasture perimeter, and he thought about it while Pio came over the ridge at noon on a lathered horse with a leather satchel tied to his saddle, and the expression of a man who has ridden through the night and considers it worth it. Anselmo Vega had confirmed everything. Pio delivered the satchel to Cornelius at the barn and then took his horse to water, and Cornelius took the satchel to the front room where Lydia was waiting, and they opened it together on the desk. Anselmo Vega had spent the early hours of the morning in the records room of the county recorder's office with Pio waiting in the street below. He had pulled the deeds that Cornelius had named in the letter and compared the filed versions against the originals in the bound ledgers that predated Price's tenure of influence in the county. He had found discrepancies in 4 deeds, not identical in their language but identical in their structure, the buried clause in the complex paragraph, the technical transfer language disguised as agreement language. He had copied them by hand, copying both the discrepant filed version and the original language from the ledger, with his signature and the date and his official title on each page to authenticate them. He had also found, in a file that had been misfiled rather than destroyed, a letter from Lydia Merritt to the county recorder dated 3 weeks before her disappearance, in which she identified the same discrepancy in the Merritt land's historic title documents and asked for clarification on the legal implications. Cornelius read that letter 3 times. He held it in his hands and read it 3 times, and the 3rd time he set it down very carefully on the desk and pressed both palms flat on the surface and breathed. Lydia, who had read it over his shoulder, said nothing. She put her hand on his arm very lightly and left it there for 3 seconds and then took it away. It was the most careful and precise comfort he had ever been offered, and it hit him somewhere so deep he had to look away from her for a moment to get his composure back. She knew, he said. She found what she was looking for and she told someone and he took her. He took her, Lydia confirmed quietly. And then he filed a story about voluntary departure so there would be no investigation. The rage was back, the cold, purposeful kind, and this time it had an object and a structure and the particular energy of 4 years of compressed grief behind it. He stood up from the desk and went to the window and made himself look at the yard and the hills and the ordinary world for a moment, until the rage settled back into something he could use rather than something that would use him. "We have enough to send to Marsh," Lydia said behind him. "Anselmo's documentation plus the pattern you've described plus Lydia's letter, that is a federal case. It's not just land fraud anymore. It's evidence of what happened to Lydia and to my father. Marsh needs to file it today," he said. "If Price suspects that Vega has given us anything—" "Pio also left the 2nd packet for Deputy Marshal Clay," she said. "I asked him when he came in. Clay's office received Pio directly. Clay read your letter in front of Pio and said he would send a rider to the U.S. Marshal's office in Las Vegas today. Cornelius turned around. You thought to confirm that, he said. I thought to ask about it, she said, with the slight precision of someone who distinguishes between claiming credit and reporting fact. He looked at her across the room and felt something come loose in the part of him that had been held closed for 4 years. Not dramatically, not in the way of a man falling apart, but in the way of a door that has been locked so long the locking mechanism has rusted, and then someone finally applies the right pressure, and it opens quietly, like it was always ready. He crossed the room toward her before he had made a decision to cross it, and she looked up at him as he came, and she did not move back, which he had already learned was one of the things about her that was simply true. She did not move back from things. He stopped with 2 feet of distance between them, which was not the same as distance at all in a house-sized room, and he said, in a voice that came out quieter than intended, "Why did you come here truly? Not because of Aldred, not only because of Price. Why this ranch?" She held his gaze. "Because Aldred told me Cornelius Merritt was the most stubborn, most honest, most thoroughly sealed-off man in 3 territories, and that a leaner had loved him absolutely, and that someone had taken from him the thing that mattered most. And I thought." She stopped. "What did you think?" he said. "That a man who had been loved absolutely by someone like Eleanor Merritt was probably worth knowing," she said, "even if he had decided the world was better kept at arm's length." The silence between them had a completely different quality now than the silences of the day before. It was not the silence of 2 people who were working together or processing danger together or even trusting each other with the things around the central problem. It was the silence of 2 people who have arrived at the edge of something and are both looking at it. "I should warn you," he said carefully, "that I have been reliably told I am difficult." "I have been reliably described as relentless," she said. "I noticed that yesterday," he said. Something moved in her expression that was not quite a smile but inhabited the same territory. "And yet here we are." "And yet here we are," he said. He did not kiss her. It was not the moment for that, and he was, underneath everything, a man who understood timing. But he reached out and took her hand in both of his, the calloused rancher's hands that had been good for work and terrible at tenderness for 4 years, and he held it with the particular care of someone handling something they are afraid to drop, and she let him, and they stood there in the front room of the house he had built with his hands while outside on the mesa walls the afternoon sun turned everything gold. Then Tomas knocked on the door and opened it and said, "Riders coming. 4 of them. Price is with them." The moment broke cleanly, and Cornelius released her hand, and they both turned toward the door because this was also simply true about both of them. They did not run from things. Price came into the yard with 3 men who were built specifically to communicate the possibility of violence without actually committing it. The kind of hired presence that says there are resources available if the polite conversation should fail to resolve things. He was smiling when Cornelius came out, and the smile was the kind he wore when he had calculated that he held all the cards. "Cornelius," he said, "I was hoping we could have that conversation about the alderman grazing rights after all." "The alderman grazing rights," Cornelius said evenly, "are not what you're here about." Price's smile did not waver. He looked at the barn, at the hands positioned around the yard, at the house behind Cornelius where Lydia stood in the doorway. His eyes on Lydia had a quality that made Cornelius's jaw tight. "I understand there may be some confusion about certain legal matters," Price said. "Miss Yates has, I believe, formed some unfortunate misapprehensions about my business dealings. I thought it might be worth having a frank conversation, clear the air." "The air is clear enough," Cornelius said. "We're done here." Price's smile adjusted itself just slightly into something that belonged less to the social register and more to the calculating one. "Cornelius, you're a practical man. What you've got on this ranch is worth protecting. I'd hate to see any complications arise from old misunderstandings." "Is that a threat, Garland?" Cornelius said it quietly and without heat, the way a man asks a factual question. "It's friendly advice," Price said. "Then I'll take it under the same consideration I take all your friendly advice," Cornelius said. "And now you're going to turn around and ride off my property, and the next time you come, you're going to bring a lawyer and come in an official capacity, because this is the last time I receive you informally." Something passed over Price's face, a flash of calculation resolving into decision. He looked again at Lydia in the doorway and then back at Cornelius, and there was a moment, a real moment of genuine threat, in which the situation could have turned entirely differently. But Price looked at Cornelius's face and at the hands positioned around the yard and at something in the total stillness of the scene, and he made a calculation. He tipped his hat. "We'll speak again," he said. Rode out. His men went with him. Cornelius watched until they were around the bend, and then he let out a slow breath, and Tomas beside him did the same. "He's gone to regroup," Tomas said. "He's gone to find out what we have and how far it's gone," Cornelius said. "We need Marsh to file before the end of today." "Pio rode fresh to Amarillo after Santa Fe," Tomas said. "He'll reach Marsh this evening. If Marsh acts tonight, the filing will be in federal records before morning," Lydia said. She had come down from the porch to stand beside Cornelius, and he registered her presence the way he was beginning to register it, as something solid and particular that was simply where she was. "Then we wait," Cornelius said, "and we keep watch." The evening came in slowly. Domingo cooked. Tomas kept the watch rotating. Cornelius sat on the porch in the settling dark with Lydia beside him in the other chair, and they did not talk about what they were waiting for but about other things. She told him about a horse she'd had as a girl, a pinto with a contrary personality that she had loved fiercely for 8 years. He told her about the first winter on this ranch, when the snow had come in October and stayed until March, and he had been certain more than once that neither the cattle nor himself were going to make it through, and how stubborn that had made him about everything after. "The land made you stubborn," she said. "The land finished what I'd started," he said. She laughed, and it was the first time he'd heard her laugh properly, not the restrained thing from the kitchen with Domingo, but a real laugh, and it landed in his chest like something landing home. He looked at her in the porch dark, and she was looking at the stars, and he thought, "I have been past feeling anything for 4 years, and I am not past it anymore. And that is her fault, and also I am not going to tell her that tonight, and also I think I might tell her before very long." 2 days later, the documents arrived. Theodore Marsh had moved with the urgency of a young lawyer who understood that a case like this either made a career or destroyed one, and had chosen to bet on it making one. He had filed the documentation with the Federal Circuit Court in Santa Fe, citing the Anselmo Vega records, the pattern evidence from Cornelius's detailed account, and a liener's letter, which was the specific piece that had transformed a land fraud case into something with teeth at the criminal level. Deputy Marshal Clay, whose rider had reached the U.S. Marshal's office in Las Vegas in 24 hours, had simultaneously applied for a federal warrant based on Cornelius's letter. Garland Price was formally served with notice of federal proceedings on a Thursday morning, at his own house, by 2 federal marshals who had ridden from Las Vegas with a warrant that named 5 specific counts including fraud, coercion, and conspiracy to obstruct justice in connection with the disappearance of 2 named individuals. Cornelius received word by rider that same afternoon. He was at the north fence line where he had been the morning Lydia arrived, though it felt like a different life ago, and he read the brief note that Tomas had sent out to him, and then stood with it in his hand in the afternoon sun, and felt something he had not felt in 4 years. Relief. Not resolution, because resolution would take time and the legal process was long and complicated, and Price had resources and lawyers. But the beginning of something that had a shape, an actual shape, where for 4 years there had only been the shapelessness of a grief without an answer. He rode back to the ranch, and he found Lydia at a liener's garden, which she had apparently discovered that morning, and was doing something careful and deliberate too, in a way that he could not identify from a distance. She was kneeling in the dirt between the tomato plants and the rosemary, and she looked up when she heard him come around the corner of the house, and she read his face before he said a word. "It's done," she said. "It started," he said, "which is not the same, but it started." She stood up from the garden and brushed the dirt from her hands and looked at him, and the afternoon light was on her face the way it had been on the second day, the gold light that made everything look decided and clear. "Alina would be glad," she said. He walked to her, and this time he did not stop 2 feet away. He stopped close enough that he could see the specific green of her eyes in the afternoon light, and he said, with the directness of a man who has decided that the time for careful approach has passed, "I have been trying to determine for 2 days whether what I feel is the ordinary response to unexpected human connection or whether it's specifically you." She looked up at him. "What have you concluded?" "That it's specifically you," he said, "and that I am not certain what to do with that." "Well," she said with that almost smile that lived just below the surface, "you could start with telling me." "I just told you," he said. "So you did," she said. He kissed her then, with the particular deliberateness of a man who does not do anything without meaning it, and she kissed him back with the particular steadiness of a woman who does not move back from things, and it was not a tentative or uncertain kiss, but one that had the quality of something confirmed, some truth that both of them had been moving toward since the moment she had walked up to his fence line with her carpetbag and her letter, and said his name. The sun was not quite at the second sunset. It was halfway there, hanging gold above the western mesa, and the cottonwoods along the creek were rattling in the afternoon wind, and Alina's garden smelled of rosemary and dry earth, and Cornelius Merritt, who had been certain for 4 years that he was past feeling anything, stood in the yard of the ranch he had built with his own hands and felt everything. The legal proceedings against Garland Price took 7 months. They were not simple months. Price's lawyers were expensive and tenacious, and there were delays and counter-motions and 3 separate attempts to discredit Anselmo Vega's documentation, all of which failed because Vega was meticulous, and because Theodore Marsh turned out to be exactly the kind of young lawyer who was capable of becoming a formidable one when the cause was right. The Federal Circuit Court found Garland Price guilty on 3 of the 5 counts in the spring of 1879, including the fraud charge and 2 counts of conspiracy. He was sentenced to 15 years in the federal penitentiary in Colorado. His land holdings were placed in receivership pending restitution proceedings, which meant that the families of Robert Yates and the 3 other men Cornelius had identified were entitled to make claims. There was no body found for Robert Yates. There was no body found for Alina. What the investigation did find, in a set of records recovered from Price's private office by the federal marshals, was evidence that both of them had been killed, and that 2 of Price's men had disposed of them in ways that destroyed any trace. It was a terrible thing to know and a necessary one, and both Cornelius and Lydia received the confirmation in private, and then came together in the kitchen of the main house, and sat with it in the particular silence of people who have had their worst fears confirmed, and have decided to survive the confirmation. Lydia cried, finally, for the first time since Cornelius had known her, not in the performed way of someone seeking comfort, but in the quiet, shaking way of someone who has been holding a weight for 2 years and has finally been given permission to put it down. He held her, this man who had forgotten how to hold anyone, and it turned out that the capacity for it had not gone anywhere, only waited. She recovered herself in 10 minutes because she was Lydia Yates, and she wiped her eyes and straightened her back and said, "I want to be buried near my father when I die, wherever he is, even if we don't know exactly where." "We'll find a place," Cornelius said. "Near the river." She looked at him. "The Cimarron." "Yes," he said. "Because it was the last place he was, and because it's beautiful, and because I believe in burying people near beauty." She held his hand for a long time without speaking, And outside the kitchen window, the spring was coming into the cottonwoods with the particular bright green of the first leaves, and Aliner's garden was beginning to wake up again without being asked. They were married in May of 1879. The ceremony was performed by the judge in Santa Fe, which was practical and without ceremony in the formal sense, though Domingo cooked for 3 days beforehand in preparation for the celebration dinner afterward, which was entirely impractical and very ceremonial, and attended by all 9 of the ranch hands and Tomas and Pio and Anselmo Vega, who had come from Santa Fe specifically, and sat at the table with the dignity of a man who has done something that mattered and knows it. Theodore Marsh sent a letter of congratulations from Amarillo. Deputy Marshal Clay sent a bottle of whiskey from Las Vegas with a note that said simply, "Well deserved." They danced after dinner in the yard while Domingo played his guitar and 2 of the hands played fiddle, and the evening was warm and the stars were out, and Lydia danced with the ease of someone who has stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop and has decided to be present in the good thing. Cornelius did not dance particularly well, a fact he had warned her about in advance, but he danced with her anyway, which she said was the point. The ranch grew. Not dramatically in the first year, but steadily, the way honest growth happens, through good decisions made consistently and work done without shortcuts. Lydia took over the management of the books from old Petrus, who had been making quiet errors for 2 years due to failing eyesight, and who was relieved to hand the task off with more visible dignity than the relief warranted. She proved to have a sharp head for numbers and an instinct for where money was being wasted, and within a year the operation was running more efficiently than it ever had, which Cornelius acknowledged to Tomas in a conversation Lydia never heard, as one of the best things that had happened to the ranch since the creek retained its course after the floods of 1876. She expanded Aliner's garden. Not to replace it, but to honor it, planting the things Aliner had grown alongside new things she wanted to grow, and in the combination created something that was its own thing without erasing what had come before. Cornelius helped her with the planting on Sundays, which he had not expected to enjoy and did. Their first child, a boy they named Robert Cornelius Merritt, was born in the spring of 1880, and he arrived into the world with the particular robust insistence of someone who has opinions about being here. Domingo held him first, after Lydia, and regarded him with the expression of a man confronting something he had suspected would happen, and his discovering is even better than anticipated. Tomas stood at the doorway of the bedroom with his hat in his hands and looked at the child with something in his face that Cornelius had not seen there before, something soft and old. Cornelius held his son in the main room of the house he had built, while the afternoon light came through the window and the cottonwoods moved along the creek, and Aliner's garden was in full spring bloom below the window, and he felt the specific fullness of a life that had been emptied and filled again. He thought about the 4 years of numbness, and the morning Lydia had appeared at his fence line, and the second sunset after which he had known that he was not past feeling anything, had never been, had only been waiting without knowing he was waiting. He told Lydia this that evening when the baby was sleeping, and the house was quiet, and they were sitting on the porch in the warm spring night, her head against his shoulder. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I know. I knew it when you lowered the gun in the barn." "That was the second night," he said. "The second sunset," she said. "You proved it before the second sunset ended," he said. She looked up at him. "Is that when you knew?" "That's when I started knowing," he said. "I finished knowing in the garden when you laughed." "My laugh," she said. "Your laugh," he said. "Among other things." She smiled, the full version, the one that had been there since the beginning and that he had been cataloging as irrelevant and that had never once been irrelevant. "What other things?" she asked in the tone of a woman who knows the answer and wants to hear it said. He told her. He was not an eloquent man. He told her in the plain, specific language of a man who means every word he uses, which is its own kind of eloquence. The way she held her pen, the way she didn't move back from things, The way she had put her hand on his arm when he read Aliner's letter, and then taken it away at exactly the right moment. The way she had said she was tired of being afraid alone, as if it was a simple fact rather than the bravest thing she had said. She listened to all of it, and when he had finished, she put her hand on the side of his face in the dark and said, "You were never past feeling anything, Cornelius. You were just waiting for something worth feeling." He put his hand over hers. "Yes," he said simply. They stayed on the porch until the baby woke and Lydia went in to him, and Cornelius sat alone in the warm night for a few minutes looking at the stars and the silhouette of the mesa walls and the dark shape of the cottonwoods along the creek. And he thought about Alina, which he could now do without the seal of grief closed over it, but with the cleaner kind of sorrow that belongs to a love that was real and was taken, and is honored by living well afterward. He thought about Robert Yates, whom he had never met but who had raised the woman who was now his wife, and he thought Yates had done something right in raising her, and he hoped the man had known that. He went inside to his wife and his son. The restitution proceedings from Price's conviction returned a portion of the Yates property value to Lydia the following year, not the full amount and not the land itself, which had passed through multiple hands and could not be simply reclaimed, but enough to matter. Cornelius wanted to invest it in the ranch, and Lydia said no. She wanted to give a portion of it to Anselmo Vega, who had taken a significant personal risk, and whose family's own land claim had been partially upheld in the proceedings. Cornelius said that was the right thing to do. Lydia gave Anselmo a letter with the bank draft and a handwritten note that said, "Your courage made everything possible. Please use this for your own future and your family's." Anselmo Vega wrote back, "It was time someone fought back. Thank you for giving me the reason." He came to visit the ranch the following spring and stayed 3 days and became, in the way these things happen in small communities built on shared consequence, a lasting friend of both Cornelius and Lydia. He eventually rose to the position of county recorder himself, which everyone agreed was exactly right. Theodore Marsh built the practice Aldred had founded into one of the most respected legal offices in the Texas and New Mexico territory, and he never took a case from Garland Price or anyone like him, which became the thing he was known for and which he was proud of. He corresponded with Lydia for years, brief and practical letters about legal matters that gradually became warmer, as if he was practicing the skill of friendship through official correspondence, and finding it suited him. Garland Price served 11 of his 15 years in the federal penitentiary in Colorado. He died there in 1890, which was not something Cornelius or Lydia ever discussed as justice, because they did not have that kind of bitterness, but which closed the chapter in the way that things close when the person responsible for them is no longer present in the world. The Merritt Ranch continued to grow through the 1880s. They added land to the east when the alderman grazing rights were assigned fairly through the new county board process, a process that was materially different from what it would have been under Price's influence. They hired 3 more hands and built a second barn and a bunkhouse that Domingo declared architecturally inferior to the main house, which Cornelius said was the highest praise Domingo was capable of. Their second child, a girl they named Clara Lydia Merritt, was born in 1882, and she came into the world with a calm that was entirely her own, looking at the lantern light with dark Yates eyes and the patient attention of someone who has arrived somewhere and is taking stock of it. Lydia recovered from the birth slowly, and Cornelius managed the house and the ranch simultaneously for 3 weeks with the controlled efficiency of a man who has decided something is going to be done and will therefore do it. And Domingo assisted him with more grace than either of them acknowledged, cooking extra and keeping the kitchen stocked and checking on Lydia with the elaborate casualness of someone pretending not to be concerned while being absolutely concerned. Robert was 2.5 by then, and he approached his new sister with the cautious scientific interest of a child who has been told a thing is coming and is now assessing whether the actual thing matches the description. He decided, after a 3-day assessment period, that she was acceptable. Cornelius watched this process with something he recognized after a moment as amusement, which he had forgotten was available to him, and which Lydia told him later looked good on him. She was sitting up in bed the evening of the 3rd day with the baby at her breast, and Robert on the bed beside her looking at a picture book. And Cornelius came in from the day's work, and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the three of them in the lamplight. And the particular quality of what he felt was not the fierce, precarious love of a man who has been through loss and knows how quickly things can be taken, though that was part of it, but also the quieter, deeper thing that belongs to people who have built something real together, who have come through fire and found themselves still standing on the other side, holding each other's hands. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and Lydia looked at him and said, "You're tired," in the tone she used when she was observing rather than judging, and he said, "It's the good kind," and she said, "I know," and moved over to give him room. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him with the baby between them and Robert on the other side turning picture book pages with the concentration of the very young. And outside the window, the last light was going over the mesa, and the cottonwoods were dark shapes against the pale sky, and Aliner's garden was quiet and full of growth. There was a third child in 1885, another boy, James Thomas Merritt, named partly for Tomas Esperanza, who received the honor with the composed dignity that was his way of receiving everything that mattered to him too much to acknowledge directly. James was a loud, energetic child who appeared to have decided from birth that the world was a fascinating and manageable problem, and who kept the household in a state of cheerful disorder that Robert dealt with philosophically and Clara dealt with by establishing very clear territorial boundaries at a remarkably young age. Tomas, who had never married and who Cornelius had once asked about this, and received a long, thoughtful answer about the particular freedoms and privations of a man who loved his work as much as he did, became something like an uncle to all three children, and they treated him with the specific respect that children extend to adults who take them seriously, which Tomas always did. Domingo remained in his kitchen and outlasted everyone's expectation of when he might slow down, cooking with the same territorial authority at 65 that he had brought to it at 53. He taught Lydia 3 recipes that he had never taught anyone, which she recorded carefully in a book, and which Clara would eventually teach her own children. He sat at the table on the holidays and ate with the family, and corrected everyone's manners with the equal opportunity criticism that was his version of affection. The years passed in the way good years pass, not without difficulty, because life does not grant exemption from difficulty, but with the particular texture of years that are built on something solid. There were hard winters and cattle losses and dry summers and the ordinary grief of time, which takes people and changes landscapes and shifts the world beneath you even when you are standing still. Old Petrus died in 1883, and they buried him at the far edge of the ranch where he had liked to sit. A new hand named Guillermo came in 1884 and stayed for 30 years. The creek flooded twice in the late 1880s and damaged the lower fence lines and was repaired. Cornelius and Lydia fought sometimes, in the direct, specific way of two people who are not afraid of each other, and who believe disagreements should be addressed rather than accumulated. The fights were real and occasionally fierce and always resolved, because neither of them was capable of the kind of sustained withdrawal that makes conflict permanent. They would argue, and then Lydia would go to the garden and Cornelius would go to the barn, and they would come back together at dinner, and say what needed to be said and find the way through. He told her once, after a particular argument about the management of the Alderman grazing section that had gone longer than either of them had wanted, that she was the most difficult person he had ever known. She told him he was the most difficult person she had ever known. They looked at each other for a moment. "Good thing we're suited to each other," she said. Apparently, he said. And that was the end of that. They grew older together in the way that people who have built something real grow older, which is to say the aging happened around the central thing without diminishing it, the way the land weathers without becoming less itself. Cornelius's hair went gray at the temples and then gray everywhere by his mid-40s, and the lines around his eyes deepened, and he remained the kind of man who filled a room not by trying to, but by simply being completely present in it. Lydia's dark hair went silver-streaked in her mid-40s in a way that Cornelius told her was beautiful, and that she told him was an objective observation rather than a compliment, and he said it was both. Robert grew up and took to the cattle business with the natural competence of someone who has been watching it since birth, and by the time he was 20, he was working alongside Cornelius with the easy authority of a man who has found his place. He married a woman named Petra from Santa Fe in 1901, a practical and warm-hearted woman with a strong sense of humor that Lydia liked immediately and Cornelius approved of for reasons he expressed through continued competent behavior at the dinner table rather than words, which Petra found both amusing and endearing. Clara went east to study, which she had wanted to do since she was 12, and which Cornelius and Lydia discussed for 2 weeks and ultimately supported, because they were people who had made difficult choices themselves and understood the necessity of letting others do the same. She came back 3 years later with a teaching certificate and an independent mind that she had possessed before she left, but that had been given formal credentials. And she taught school in the valley town for 15 years, and was the kind of teacher that children remembered all their lives. James turned out to be the rancher's rancher of the 3, with an appetite for the land itself that went past even Cornelius's, if that was possible, and he was at home in the saddle and in the high country in a way that suggested the territory had been waiting for him specifically. He was also the one who found the words for things, which was not something he got from his father, and which Lydia said was a gift from someone further back in the family and Cornelius privately suspected was all Lydia. In 1902, on a warm October evening very like the one on which Lydia Yates had first stepped off the afternoon stage with her carpetbag and her letter of introduction, Cornelius and Lydia sat on the front porch of the house he had built with his hands 25 years before, in the same chairs they had occupied on the night he'd told her what he felt in the garden, and they watched the sun go down over the mesa walls in the usual extravagance of red and orange. The grandchildren were asleep inside. Robert's son, a 4-year-old named Cornelius James Merritt, which no one had asked Cornelius about in advance and which had rendered him briefly speechless, was asleep in the spare room with his 3-year-old sister. Clara was staying for the week. James was at the north pasture and would be back in the morning. Domingo had finally, at 78, agreed to take his meals at the table with everyone and allow someone else to cook them, which was a negotiation that had taken 2 years, and which he had framed as a concession to the convenience of others rather than a recognition of his own limits. He was asleep in his room behind the kitchen, which had been his room for 30 years. Tomas had retired from the day-to-day running of the ranch 3 years ago and lived in the small house at the eastern edge of the property that they had built for him specifically, and he came for dinner twice a week and still walked the fence lines on his good days. "Do you ever think about that first morning?" Lydia asked. Cornelius turned to look at her in the evening light. "Which part?" "The fence line," she said. "When you came back from the north pasture and found me there." "I thought you were trouble," he said. "I was trouble," she said. "The best kind," he said. She smiled at him with the full smile, the one that had been irrelevant until it wasn't. 23 years of marriage had not made it less particular. He had come to understand that some things do not become ordinary with repetition. They become more specifically themselves. "Do you remember what you thought when you lowered the gun?" she said. "I thought I had no idea who you were, and that you were standing in my barn telling me my dead wife had not left me, and that I was going to have to decide very quickly whether to trust you," he said. And, and I thought the name Alina should not sound that way coming from a stranger, and that it didn't entirely, which told me something. What did it tell you? That you weren't entirely a stranger, he said, even then. She reached across and put her hand over his on the arm of the chair, the same way she had done 23 years ago in the front room when he had read Alina's letter, and he turned his hand over and held hers. And they sat together watching the last of the light leave the sky above the mesa, while inside the house the grandchildren slept, and somewhere out on the north pasture James was moving cattle in the gathering dark, and the cottonwoods along the creek moved in the evening wind the way they always had and always would. I was so afraid that first day, she said. I didn't let you see it. I know, he said. I saw it anyway. She looked at him. You said nothing. You didn't need me to, he said. You were managing it. The kindest thing was to let you. She was quiet for a moment, then, you have always known exactly the right amount of space to give. He thought about that. It's a rancher's skill, he said. You have to know when to move toward and when to give room, with cattle, with people. He paused. With you. With me, she said, and something in her voice was warm and old and completely itself. The last light went. The stars came out in their immense and untroubled patterns. The night air carried the smell of dry earth and the faint sweetness of the garden, and somewhere in the house a child murmured in its sleep and was quiet again. Cornelius Merritt, who had been certain for 4 years that he was past feeling anything, sat on his porch with his wife's hand in his and the life they had built around him, and felt, with the full and quiet and completely open capacity of a man who has learned that love is not a thing you are done with but a thing that grows if you tend it, everything. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole world.